Former governor of South Carolina, ambassador to the United Nations, presidential hopeful, and declared candidate for 2024, joins us. Governor, thanks for being with us on Good Morning New Hampshire.
Good morning. It's great to be back with you.
I want to get to the budget and economics in a moment, but I one of the things we talk a lot, I had one of the top agents from the DEA on yesterday's show, in the southwest border in New Hampshire, New England, Maine, more and more fentanyl overdose deaths. Young people, number one cause of death in America, a drug overdose. That's sad. Mental health issues as well. But what about human trafficking? And we know what happened to the 4 Americans out of Brownsville, Texas, in Matamoros, 2 killed, cartels. President Biden's press secretary the other day said he's doing a lot of great things with the border and stopping the flow of fentanyl. Do you agree?
Not at all. And not only that, she said it's at its lowest numbers, which I don't even know where she got that from. Look, we had enough fentanyl crossover last year that would kill every single American. There's a problem. There's a problem with gangs. There's a problem with drugs. There's a problem with Mexico. And it has to be dealt with. And we need to really take it to them. I mean, either they deal with it or we deal with it. But we can't put our families at risk. This is a massive national security issue that needs to be dealt with. And, you know, I think we've given them enough opportunity to deal with it. I think it's time that we kind of take it into our own hands.
Well, Governor Abbott has declared 2 or 3 of the cartels across from Texas and Mexico terrorist organizations. Do you think we have to do more to dismantle the cartels, or at least their financial centers or their drug labs?
Look, I think we treat it just like ISIS. I think, you know, you consider them for the terrorists that they are, but you also bring in our special ops, bring in our intelligence. Let's do exactly what we did when we took out ISIS, and let's get rid of it. We could do it actually pretty quickly if we decided to focus on that. But I don't think we need to wait on Mexico anymore, because clearly there's no urgency for them to go and stop the threats that are crossing our borders. And on top of that, let's not forget where that fentanyl is coming from in the first place. Mm-hmm. We need to call out China. China knows exactly what they're doing.
Nikki Haley, I want to talk about the economy. Americans wake up each day. The markets have been down more often than not recently. Inflation is still out of control. It doesn't seem like the higher interest rates, the hiking, are slowing down consumer spending. Brian Moynihan, CEO, head of Bank of America, one of our great partners and sponsors, said the other day, and I take him at his word, we're going into a recession in Q3, which probably, I'm guessing, I don't know what Brian would say, we might go into Q4, the end of the year. We have inflation each day. As I said, President Biden is going to roll out his budget plans, I think, today. What do you think about inflation, the economy, and what do you think of what the president's budget is going to be? And do they have a handle on inflation, this administration or the Fed?
Well, let's take it down to, you know, everyday families. I mean, you've got 1 in 6 families can't pay their utility bill. You've got, you know, 60% of Americans who are now in credit card debt. You've got half of Americans who say they're not as financially comfortable or well off as they were a year ago. I mean, it goes to show what's happening, but how do you do it? You know, when you look at inflation, the first thing is let's start making things in America again. That's when you start to bring inflation down. But we've got a real spending problem. And, you know, I've always spoken real truths when it comes to it, hard truths when we need to hear it. This is Republicans and Democrats did this to us. This isn't Biden. We are $31 trillion in debt. Republicans started this when they passed that big $2.2 trillion stimulus. And that vote in the House was 419 to 6. In the Senate, it was 96 to 0. Since then, the Democrats have just run with it. Republicans and Democrats expanded all of the welfare that we had. Now 90 million people in America are on Medicaid. 42 million are on food stamps. It's not sustainable. And so what do Republicans do on top of that? They join the Democrats and they open back up earmarks for the first time in 10 years. So now they gave $2 billion to counties that don't even exist or have government budgets, $7 million to horse racing. You know, I mean, you've got to look at what's happening. $20 billion in welfare to illegal immigrants. That's not how we want our money spent. And Biden's solution today is going to be, let's fix the entitlement situation. Let's fix the budget situation by raising taxes. That's the lazy way out. No, the way we fix it is you go and you say, cut the spending, cut the credit card up, no more borrowing, 15% of our budget's interest, let's stop borrowing. You say stop the spending. Don't pass another bill unless it takes us back to pre-COVID spending, and make sure that Republicans and Democrats know that. Cut off all the earmarks. That has to stop. Let's claw back $500 billion in unspent COVID money, and let's bring that back in. $100 billion went to fraud. Instead of IRS agents going after innocent Americans, go after that $100 billion in COVID fraud. And yes, let's talk about entitlements. Let's start talking about what entitlement reform will look like. And that doesn't mean you take any money away from seniors or those close to retirement. My parents are in their 80s. I don't want anybody touching theirs, but my kids are in their 20s. And I think we start having a conversation with them as the next generation going in, and you say, look, we need to raise the retirement age for those that are in their 20s. We need to go and talk about the fact that we need to limit the benefits that go to wealthy people so that they don't get as much. Let's expand Medicare Advantage so that there's more competition. When we start to do those types of things, change the cost of living to what actual inflation is, those will do dramatic things to our economy and get us back on track.
Nikki Haley, good morning, New Hampshire GMI Studios. I want to ask you, Governor Chris Sununu of New Hampshire, you're familiar, you know of him, said last weekend, I think to Chuck Todd, that if the New Hampshire first in the nation presidential primary were held today on the Republican side, if it were held today, Governor DeSantis would win it. Do you agree?
Well, I think if you look at the polls today, but never in history can you look at the polls a year out and say that what it said a year ago will be the same thing a year from now. We're going to have completely different poll numbers a year from now. You're going to have a debate in August. You're going to have, Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina coming up. So there's going to be a lot of changes that are going to happen. I'm not worried about the polls today. Ask me about the polls in January. Those are going to be the ones I care about.
Speaking of Governor DeSantis, quickly, one of the key issues certainly Democrats are going to try and make as we head into 2024 is a lot about the abortion issue. We saw that in the midterms here in New Hampshire after the Supreme Court decision on Roe v. Wade, making it a state issue. In Florida, just news in the last day or two, Governor DeSantis, Republican legislature there, seemed to be supporting a new measure that would further restrict abortions. I believe in Florida, and DeSantis, I think, has indicated support for making abortions more difficult after 6 weeks. Is that something you agree with?
Well, I am strongly pro-life, but I'm not pro-life because the Republicans tell me to be. I'm pro-life because my husband was adopted and we had trouble having our children. Listen, this issue is very personal to women and to men, and I don't think unelected justices need to be deciding this. I do think this needs to go to the people, but what we have to do is I don't judge anyone that's pro-choice any more than I want them judging me for being pro-life. We've got to find out what that consensus number is. We all know that we should not be having abortions up until the time of birth. That's horrific, and it's got to stop. And our goal should be, how do we save as many babies as we possibly can?
Right.
Let's figure out what that number is. Is it 6 weeks? Is it 12 weeks? Is it 15 weeks? Let's figure that out. But we need to have consensus on how we do it, and we need to move forward.
You don't have an opinion on where, like in New Hampshire, this last midterm, the legislature, through the budget, and the Governor Sununu had supported this, was really only restricting abortions in the last trimester, 7th, 8th, or 9th month. Nothing before 6 months. And yet Democrats here called it the Sununu abortion ban, but there was no ban on abortions up until and through 6 months. This measure in Florida would make it 6 weeks. You don't have a number attached. You just want consensus.
Look, I want the people to decide. I can tell you that if it were up to me, every state would be pro-life, but I think the people need to decide that. I think that needs to be decided by them. Is it the time of heartbeat? Is it time pain capable? Like I did in South Carolina, where we ended up doing 20 weeks in South Carolina, but where do you go when you draw that line? And I think that is something that every state needs to decide. That's something that elected officials need to decide. What we don't need to do is fight over whether it should be, at the time of birth. We need to figure out what it is so that we save as many babies as possible. That's my goal, is I want to save as many babies as possible.
I've noticed since you announced, Nikki Haley, let you go on this, former governor of South Carolina and ambassador to the United Nations, presidential candidate on the Republican side, Donald Trump, your former, president when you were in the UN role, taking some shots at you politically. Probably is a compliment in politics if you're a threat to someone. But Governor Sununu has been rather critical towards Donald Trump, saying he's not going to be the nominee in 2024. Just not going to happen. Can't get it done. My question, though, to you is, do you think in general Donald Trump, as a appealing political candidate and presidential hopeful now, do you think he's seen his biggest day in terms of the largest number of people he'd appeal to? Do you think he's less popular today with more voters than he was, say, in 2016 and when he won?
Well, I can tell you where I come from. First of all, he's a friend. It was an honor to work in the administration and do the foreign policy wins that we got done together. I think he was the right president at the right time. But whether I'm in South Carolina, where we had thousands of people at the announcements, or whether I'm in New Hampshire or Iowa, where I am today, and hundreds of people come out, people have a respect for what he did. They appreciate the things that he did, but they're ready to go in a new direction. They want to leave the drama of the past. They want to go in a way that's going to start a clean slate, and we're going to get our country back on track. And that's why I'm saying it's time for a new generation. I don't think you have to be 80 years old to be in D.C. I think it's time we look at term limits. I think it's time we look at mental competency tests for people over 75. I think it's time we stop talking about all the grievances of the past. Let's move forward. For the sake of our kids, 50% of Americans today say that they're worried their kids won't have a better life than they did. That's not okay. We can't be okay with that. That's why we want your listeners. Go to NikkiHaley.com. Let's make a difference. Let's start a new generation, and let's start being strong and proud again in America. That's when we'll start to get back on track.
As always, welcome you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Former Governor of South Carolina, Nikki Haley, presidential hopeful Republican. Thank you.
Great to be with you. Take care.
All right, going to take a break. We come back. John Decker, our own White House correspondent, he's talking about a different